And just to confirm, everyone can see the intro slide?
Yep.
Okay, sounds good. I'm going to stop talking now.
Will we see when we're actually visible to the folks, or are we there yet?
You're visible now.
Oh, great. Perfect timing. Well, hi, everyone. I'm glad to be here with you all today. As you probably are picking up on already, we'll be talking about technology and how it can allow us to connect with learning. We have a really special guest with us here today as part of our Learning Labs speaker series, which I'm happy to say that that we've been able to take from a small group discussion and really build it out so that we have the opportunity to share this with as many people as possible. My name is Omid Fotuhi. I'm the Director of Learning Innovation at WGU Labs and one of the founders of the Learning Labs speaker series, where we like to think that we create an environment where ideas come to play. The reason why we put this together is that all throughout my own graduate programs and education, I've come to realize that my most significant learning happens when during these informal and structured conversations with people who are kind enough to share their insights and on topics that they spent a lifetime reflecting on. Having had access to these ideas has benefited me both personally and professionally. My hope with the Learning Labs series is to expand that access to the rich ideas with the hopes that they empower you to lead better lives, and importantly, to apply those ideas towards the betterment of our world. In a recent conversation that I had with Jane Elliott, who is the American school teacher that conducted the Blue Eyes, Brown Eyes experiment, and is currently a heroic social justice warrior, she told me that education remains as one of the most powerful mechanisms to increase equity in our society. She says that once you learn something new, no one can take that away from you. So if you will join me today, I'd love to engage in this interactive conversation. Hope that you are able to take some time to reflect on the back and forth that we've got planned with our guest speaker. And then at the end, we've carved out some time for you all to ask questions. So throughout the conversations, if you have questions, feel free to send those in the chat. We'll be collecting those and we'll address them towards the end. But without further ado, let us please introduce you to our guest speaker, Dr. Justin Reich, that Nicole will spend just a couple of minutes giving you an intro about.
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Nicole Barbero. I'm a research scientist at WGU Labs, and I'm really excited to introduce our guest speaker today, Dr. Justin Reich. Justin is an assistant professor at Massachusetts Institute of Technology and the executive director of the MIT Teaching Systems Lab, which focuses on teacher learning and how they can better equip teachers to teach in new educational environments, especially these online and hybrid environments that we're all very familiar with this past year. The Teaching System Lab also conducts research on innovative education environments. He's published over 100 scholarly articles on education, including a prominent recent 2020 article in the Proceedings of National Academy of Sciences, which I really enjoyed, studying the effects of behavioral interventions in 247 online courses with over 250,000 students. Justin is also the author of the new book that we're going to be discussing today, Failure to Disrupt: Why Technology Alone Can't Transform Education. This book, which we'll be discussing today and its implications, focuses on the common themes of scaled online learning and also the current dilemmas that scaled online learning faces in our society today. So I am very excited to be discussing this book with you all today. We recently read it in our WGU Labs book club, which kind of prompted the conversation that we're going to be having today. It's one of my favorite books that I've read on higher ed this past year, and especially on EdTech in particular. And I encourage everyone, if you have not already picked up your own copy, I would encourage you to go do that already. And with that, I'd like to welcome Dr. Justin Reich. Justin, thank you for joining us all here today.
Thanks so much for having me. What a treat.
Of course. We're really excited, and I wanted to just kind of start off the conversation talking about kind of the main thing that's going on this past year, which is online learning. In the past year, pretty much all education has gone online from pre-K all the way through higher ed. So I'd like to start off with asking you, what do you see as the promise of EdTech, and in what ways do you think EdTech has delivered on that promise over the past year during the pandemic?
Yeah, isn't that an interesting question? So One of the promises of education technology was a kind of anytime, anywhere learning. And there's no doubt that what we've been trying to do across the world, I think at some point, maybe it was the UN or another global agency estimated that 1.6 billion learners had their learning disrupted around the world. There's a wide variety of strategies to address that in lots of countries around the world. Radio plays a really key role in addressing that. Television plays a really key role in addressing that. And in countries with better network penetration, online tools can play an important role addressing that. I think, though, if you were to go and ask the typical parent, the typical student, how's remote learning working for you? The answers mostly range from sort of disappointing to disastrous. There's a small group of learners actually who I think have found a real connection and passion for online learning during this period. I think there are some folks who've said, wait a minute, like my learning doesn't have to happen in 42-minute blocks, and I can be more directed. I can have more autonomy of what I'm doing. I can wear my pajamas all day. I don't have to be around all these people all the time. I can spend way more time by myself. There's some small population of people for whom online learning has really clicked. But boy, are there a lot of folks who have been really disappointed. And I think, the field really needs to interrogate why. Why is it the case that human beings have been trying to teach other human beings with computers for 60 years? As soon as we had computers the size of your living room, computer scientists and learning scientists have partnered together to try to make really powerful online learning experiences. And this is kind of the moment in which the world needed them most. And a lot of people are not particularly happy with the outcomes. One policy place that you can see that's kind of amazing. The last administration's U.S. Department of Education nominally was a huge supporter of online learning and choice. I mean, until March of 2020, if you had asked people in the U.S. Department of Education, kind of what's the administration position on online learning, they would have said, great opportunities, students and families know best, let them choose whatever they want. And that rapidly changed to remote learning is a disaster, the schools must be open. So that's an interesting shift in perspective. Oh, you've been muted. So I just had to keep. I was like, this is a great example of wait time. We're just gonna respectfully pause and kind of really feel that last comment. That's great.
Yeah, sorry about the brief technical issue.
The dramatic pause was, I think, hopefully useful for everybody. I certainly was reflecting on much of what you've said. There are so many questions in today's climate in terms of how we can cope with disruption. And a colleague of mine likes to remind me that it's best not to take a good pandemic for granted, that sometimes a good disruption can really help us to reflect on what is and is not working, maybe employ flexibility in terms of what we think is useful and is essential and what is not. What comes to mind is when the MOOCs first came on stage, there was this promise that MOOCs would entirely replace how we think of learning in general, but it didn't, right? Because there's still some function to that physical school environment that has some utility. One of the themes that I know that I've heard about a lot is that students are still having a hard time staying focused, staying motivated, feeling that they have the self-regulation needed to be able to continue their learning. I wonder if you can just comment on some of the themes that you've been picking up on, both from academics, administrators, or students that you think currently we're dealing with, and then perhaps what we can learn from this current disruption as we navigate through this disruption, but also beyond the disruption.
Here are three observations I have about the disruption. One is there are certain ways in which you could say, wow, look at how rapidly education systems have been able to adjust when forced to adjust. So we think of these institutions as constrained by, a set of conflicting incentives, by a complex network of stakeholders, really hard places to change. But when they had to, they did lots of things differently. You ask the K-12 school system to instantly pivot to online learning, and it doesn't go perfectly, but they do it. At the same time, one of my observations is that, as far as I can tell, pre-K through, higher education, if you say, what are the most common responses to the pandemic? It has been to reenact really conservative models of teaching and learning. There's a whole range of technologies that have been created over the last 60 years, and two of them have become particularly dominant during the pandemic, and they're two of the oldest technologies that we have. Schools at all levels have adopted some kind of learning management system if they haven't already. Learning management systems were theorized in the 60s and 70s, commercialized in the 1990s, made open source in the 2000s. And the second technology is what we're using now, video conferencing, which when it was introduced in the 1930s was called video telephony. So we have this sort of and there's all kinds of other stuff that's been built since then. We could talk specifically about MOOCs in a second, but AI, adaptive tutors, all kinds of other things. Overwhelmingly systems have chosen these two tools, and because what learning management systems and video conferencing allow you to do is reproduce as closely as possible online some facsimile of a typical classroom experience. In higher education, for the most part, instructors walked away from their lecterns last March, sat down in front of their home office webcam, and kept teaching roughly the way they were teaching before. Particularly in higher ed, we had other options. For instance, edX, Coursera, Udacity, they've spent, and their university partners, have spent hundreds of thousands of dollars making courses on topics like Intro to Microeconomics. I expected much more last March, this September, universities around the world being like, look, our economics faculty cannot at home by themselves with two kids running underneath their feet all the time, trying to get their own kids into school, make an introduction to economics course that's better than the one that blank university already made for $200,000. So just this semester for Intro to Microeconomics, go online, take their course, come to us for a recitation, and we'll write you your own final exam and proctor it and things like that. But really, you're going to get a much better, more polished learning experience from that. The demand for that kind of approach, as far as I can tell, has been almost zero. That students would rather have the introduction to microeconomics lectures, that the teacher is making in her pajamas with two kids running underneath her feet, than the one that was professionally produced for all these hundreds of thousands of dollars. At MIT, we sort of have both of these options. Like almost all of our faculty, some substantial portion of faculty have already digitized their courses. And our MIT students, who we select for their ability to be self-regulated independent learners, say to us, no, we want our own personal synchronous lecture. Even if it's the exact same content that you have online that's already recorded, we want our version of it. And I think we should be spending a lot of time asking questions why. Why is it that we had all these alternatives? People said, no, I actually want a bunch of synchronous learning because that's part of the way that it helps me self-regulate. Like it's actually not that helpful for me to have anytime, anywhere learning because if you don't tell me to show up at 10 a.m., I won't do it. That even as weak as these connections are through these screens, people still want that over recorded video. Even if you're going to say the exact same thing, if there's a recording of you, probably a better version of it. I still want to be with you in that moment. And then to have these other kinds of peer connections. So I think we sort of have to wrestle with this duality that in some respects, systems change dramatically. But if you look at the range of choices that people adopted, their pedagogical structural choices were very, very conservative. There are, in American high schools, I don't think there's more than a handful of American high schools that you could find that adopted some kind of really new calendar or really new learning structure. I mean, the extent of innovation seems to basically be, in some places, a handful of them. Instead of doing 8-year-long courses, you did 4 courses a semester. Or in a handful of places, 2 courses for a quadmester or something like that. But I think there's something, and I would say that part of what failure to disrupt tries to argue is that, if you look at the last 30 years of education technology research, you'll find 2 findings over and over again. When teachers have access to new technology, they use them to extend existing practices. So, even when the world goes bonkers and everything is up for grab, what people gravitate to is the kinds of things that they were doing before. And then the second thing, unfortunately, that we find is that where there is innovation and opportunity, it disproportionately benefits the affluent. And that we've seen in very powerful ways during the pandemic. The most open schools, but also the most remote learning opportunities, the most supports for being able to participate in remote learning are happening in the places that are least affected by the pandemic and by the recession and by the coronavirus and all that. But the third thing to take away from all this is, sort of this balance between opportunities for change balanced with a real conservative response is that as we continue to geoengineer the chemistry of the atmosphere to be inhospitable to human civilization, what we're experiencing now may not be the last pandemic of a kindergartner's lifetime. We should expect more changes in climate to lead to different kinds of diseases, more habitat destruction to lead to more interspecies disease transmission. At the same time, the fires that we saw in American West this past summer, those might have been the worst fires of the last 100 years, but that might be the mildest climate of the next 100 years. And so schools of all kinds are going to have to become, sadly, more resilient to disruption. We're going to need as a civilization to have societies that are more able to do interrupted schooling. And so I think it's really important to learn lessons from the pandemic because we're likely to apply them more in the next century than in the last one.
Can I just follow up on that? I find it really, one of the things that I loved about your book and just where your thesis with all of your messaging comes from is that there has also been this wave of optimism and promise from EdTech or about EdTech to revolutionize how we do education, but that hasn't been the case. What I hear you speaking about now is that maybe in part at least, some of the resistance comes from the administrators and the educators because they're unwilling to change their practices. And so even though there may be potential for technology to enhance or even change, improve the learning experience, that the resistance to change might be in the hands or on the laps of the educators that we're working with. I wonder if you can comment on that.
Yeah, well, I think you can find resistance at all different kinds of sectors. You all at Western Governor University, who've done a ton of online learning, that there's tremendous value and opportunity in asynchronous learning experiences. Like I have never taken any of your courses, but my hunch is that we go through the whole thing, like the vast majority of your courses are not set up just as synchronous learning experiences. Am I right about that?
That's right. It's primarily asynchronous.
Yeah. And we, if we interviewed all of your instructional designers on February 14th, 2020, and said there's going to be a massive pandemic coming along, how much time should we devote to synchronous learning? They would be like, no, synchronous learning bad, connectivity in the United States bad, schedule coordination very difficult, do not go in that direction, not a good idea. I don't think it was educators in the K-12 system that have been demanding higher and higher doses of synchronous learning. I think educators would have been perfectly happy to experiment with some of these asynchronous models. I think it was a series of policymakers and parents who said, nope, when we reproduce the system in this new pandemic inflected world, we have to follow the same schedule that we were following beforehand. And some of that is just sort of conservative, like the world is changing, keep some things familiar. And some of it is like, no, you can't, like my child must be in front of a teacher all throughout the day, or they will go do terrible things because we use schools not just for education, but for childcare and other things like that. I was talking about this with my dear colleague, Mitchell Stevens, who is at Stanford and who studies higher education. And I was talking about the conservatism of the system and some conservatism that certainly educators and administrators had. And he said, whoa, Justin, look at the way the CARES Act was written. Higher education institutions only got supplemental funding if they agreed to maintain their model of four-year colleges, 32 credits a semester. This was a moment in which you could have had all kinds of different models emerging. Why have people continue to go to school full time during this period? It's a crazy time. Online learning works when you integrate it with workforce opportunities. Lots of people lost their jobs. Let young people go get them. And Congress said, nope. We're going to put these sort of guardrails in place. Now, mostly, I assume they put those guardrails in place because they were afraid of sketchy actors in the for-profit sector swooping in and taking a bunch of that money and providing terrible learning experiences to students with it. But that was also a sort of source of conservatism in the system. So, I pointed to you before an area in which I think students were driving conservatism in the system. There was no ground, as far as I can tell, I can't find anywhere in the world where there was some groundswell of demand by students saying, why are you making me sit in these stupid Zoom classes? We've built all of these other online learning experiences. Please let us go and let me just log into this other online thing that exists and do this online course there. Instead, I think we saw surprising demand from students for these more conservative models. So to me, it's worth interrogating why this conservatism is woven so much throughout so many actors in the system. And some of it, I think, is cultural in the sense of there's just not a lot of enthusiasm for experimenting with youth and children and learners. We want people to learn the way, we want people younger than us to learn the way that we learned. That's just sort of a cultural phenomenon. But the second piece is there's just so much that we ask schooling systems to do. We ask them to give people new credentials and to make them good citizens and to learn specific skills and to develop social skills and to find work and to appreciate beauty. And we create these incredibly intricate structures to balance all of those competing tensions. And it turns out that if you bowl through and say, oh, let's do something really different, it works well for some contexts, but there's all other stakeholders who are like, whoa, that thing where you gave people lots of independent time to work on projects, that was great for those people over there. But actually in math class, we just need 20 minutes per day with our students, not these huge long blocks. There's nothing else to do with them. You got to digest and move on. So that I think is, but I think for anyone who wants to do innovation in education technology, you have to sort of constantly confront that sort of structural conservatism. And a lot of the second half of the book is about what are some ways that we would navigate and go around that?
Yeah, you touch on the structural conservatism of the education system, and I'm curious to get your thoughts on to what extent you see that as being some constraints of our social desires within the education system. So even though we have this asynchronous online capabilities, even at WGU, which is all asynchronous classes, they offer those live cohorts. We have program mentors that are assigned to each student to help, build out that schedule and keep them motivated and accountable. We have live course instructors that are there for the students, so it's not just a packaged course that's online. There are people, and there's, you mentioned earlier on that students still want, that asynchronous or that synchronous lecture, even though it's the same content that could be delivered much better produced, in an asynchronous format. So, and there's some mention in the chat as well about the demands of, like parents and family schedules and kind of these other structures of society that are all very socially based. So I'm curious what your thoughts are to the extent that these social needs, this kind of social foundation of learning within our culture, within our education system, may account for some of that conservatism within the system.
Yeah, no, it's we think of schools like, well, aren't we supposed to transmit knowledge and skills from one generation to another? And then you say, well, actually, there's all these other things that are going on there that have to happen. That and certainly the motivation for students. I mean, when K-12 students, but I think college students in various ways as well. I think this is perhaps less strong for mid-career working kinds of students. Like they go to school to see their friends. You don't go to school because like factoring polynomials is your jam and you're totally into it. You go to school because you want to buddy up with people. And because you really care about Miss Barbaro who's teaching you how to factor polynomials and you just want to go and have that connection. That's not true for all different things. There's a whole bunch of stuff in which people are really excited for the learning themselves. But there's an awful lot, which we do. I mean, I think one of the things that we learned throughout the pandemic is how much we take for granted the social structures that are in place in schools to help support learning. We did a bunch of focus group interviews with sort of design charrettes with students and with mixed groups of students and teachers and administrators in May and June, trying to help people get ready for the next year. And there was a 13-year-old girl who was sort of imagining new schools for the next year. And she said, I wish there was just a button I could press and a teacher would show up. Sort of a little bit the opposite of what you described. You sort of described like all of these kind of on-demand things that students can go to find teachers. And she was like, no. I just want the teacher to come to me when I want it. And to some extent, that sounds like a little bit absurd. Like, how would you have a press a teacher button? But think about schools for a second. You could go as a 13-year-old girl to just about any place in a functioning school building during a normal academic year and raise your hand. And within a minute or two, a caring adult will come over to you and ask you what your issue is and how they can help you with it. Hand raising, when you sort of think through it, it's this miraculous kind of routine by which young people, literally in almost any context in schools can solicit the almost immediate attention of adults. And then you start realizing that a whole bunch of the challenges that learners have can be easily debugged by caring adults in a minute or two that are like total, bridge burners without that support. There's all kinds of learning experiences that learners have where they go, I don't get the instructions. I don't remember what I'm supposed to do. I don't understand what this person means. I don't understand this vocabulary word, where a 15-second interaction with a teacher is like, oh, okay, now I get it now. And I keep rolling. And if you don't get that little 15-second interaction, things fall apart. So, and in schools, engineering those kinds of social interactions. I mean, that was sort of a kind of instructional pedagogical one, but also engineering the ones where, oh, Omid, you look kind of blue today. Tell me how you're doing. Are trivial. They're easy to do before class, after class. When we have to do them in online settings, it's like, man, if I'm worried about Omid, like I have to schedule an extra one-on-one Zoom session with him to summon him to me at a particular time. And instead of just feeling like, hey, I'm tapping him on the shoulder, asking him how the game was and why he looks kind of sad, now he feels like he's sort of called out. There's a way in which there's all these serendipitous interactions that we take for granted in in-person spaces that have to be sort of manufactured, that have to be organized in particular ways. Now, one cool thing about the last year is all the innovative work that schools and teachers and students and families have done to generate these things. There's, I would be interested in hearing your perspectives on this. There's nowhere that I've heard of where you can go and say, you know what, these people really figured it out during the pandemic. They didn't really have it put together beforehand, but now you've got to go visit X school. And in other domains, you can hear that. If you came to me and said, what's the best project-based learning school? I could tell you. What's the best school that's doing the most innovative work in online learning integrated on campus? I could give you some suggestions. Competency-based learning. There's nowhere that I feel like we could go and be like, these folks really kind of got the pandemic learning nailed. But there's lots of innovation that's happening. It just ends up looking like sort of sanding down 1,000 rough edges rather than having one big breakthrough. And for people who are really enthusiastic about the transformative potential of education technology, that's kind of disappointing. I think what people want is the kind of breakthrough that's going to sweep away the past and open up these brand new futures. But in fact, what innovation in the book, I borrow this term from Morgan Ames, it just looks a lot more like tinkering. You figure one thing out, then you figure another thing out, then you figure a third thing out, and each of them are small, but they add up over time. As you're figuring out some new things, you forget to be good at older things, and then you have to go back to them and that sort of thing. But I think the improvements that we're seeing you know, the way through, you know, the way through getting to better social environments in weird remote hybrid learning settings isn't through some new tech or some new breakthrough. It's sort of, you know, working with students and families and teachers to sort of sand down 1,000 of these rough edges to make these things work a little bit better tomorrow than they did yesterday.
I'd like to maybe get you to kind of go a little bit more deep on that, because I love the tinkerer's mind frame approach to figuring out what works, what doesn't work, and how innovation can have impact. And you also mentioned just, you know, the serendipitous access to information that educators and administrators have in the real world physical context, where they're just sort of submerged in all these interactions. But given the remote learning of the pandemic, they're distanced from that. And as we think about tinkering, well, that also comes with the cost of being distanced from the voices of the students that you're trying to serve. And I wonder if you can speak to maybe the value of staying connected to that voice, to the constituents, their evolving needs, and maybe some of the barriers that blocks that process.
I think that's a great point, Omid, and it actually reminds me that those are, you know, if we were to go back and read things that I was writing in March of 2020, you know, the two of the things I was saying constantly was, relationships are going to be enormously important. I mean, the reason why WGU has all the things that you just described about advisors and meetups and other kinds of sessions is you just recognize that those kinds of human connections are central to people's motivation and success. It's, you know, and there are ways that we can mediate those things online. But, you know, while there are certain circumstances in which humans do a great job learning from automated computers, but for the most part, they need constant contact with people. And the second thing is, you know, for those places, you know, that are less like WGU and who, you know, who are doing primarily in-person learning beforehand in higher education or in secondary school, you just don't know how to do this and how to make this change. And so one of the best things that you can do is ask your students what they want and what works for them. You know, what I'm trying to remember what the instructional decision that, you know, there are a lot of people that were trying to sort out, okay, if we can only have kids come back 2 days a week, is it, or if we can only have kids come back half time, is it better to have them be a week on and a week off? Or is it better to have them come Monday and Tuesday every week, but not Wednesday through Friday? And one of the things I would say to those folks is, there is no research that exists that answers that question. And probably the answer doesn't matter that much. What probably matters is that as much as possible, different stakeholders feel like they have a voice in answering that question. If there is a community that sort of came to the conclusion like 1 week off and 1 week off is the best way to do it, and we're enthusiastic about trying that, that's probably the most important feature that people feel like they opted into it. You know, the other thing I was saying a lot to folks in September, which I think is still very valid advice now as we're starting another semester, there's exactly one generation of American students that has gone to school online during a pandemic, and it's the ones who are in our classrooms right now. If you want to know what kinds of practices are most effective for supporting them, especially at this point, we can just ask them. What did they tell us? Now, what prevents us from asking them? Sometimes there's a lot of students and not as many of us, but there are different ways of doing that through surveys or other kinds of stuff like that. But I also, you know, some of my colleagues in higher education who've sort of taken this advice have said, you know what, we're gonna cut some function of our classes somewhere. We're gonna cover less content. We're gonna do something else. And I'm just going to make sure that I have, you know, if all I can do is 7 minutes with each of my students, I'm going to do that too. Because I would have gotten some version of that in in-person learning, and I'm just going to make it happen. You know, even though I've got a 100-person class, I'm still going to connect with everyone at some point. So I mean, I definitely, as you know, different people are on different schedules, but as the new semester is gearing up to start, as folks are thinking about their designs, one of the big things I would do is ask students, you know, what about the last 9 months in learning has worked for you and what hasn't? And you'll get, and there's a non-zero chance that you'll get good answers that you haven't thought of that make your class better. And even if you don't, if you just adopt the things that people tell you that they're excited about, you know, then that's a way to have them feel like they're included. You know, the pandemic feels like something being done to us. Our response to it can be something that we feel like we're building together.
Yeah, kind of on that note, as you know, we've gone almost a year now of kind of fully online learning across, primary and secondary school and higher ed. A lot of institutions now are looking towards different ed tech solutions to help facilitate, their delivery of online education. So what would you say would be kind of your top considerations or recommendations for students, or I'm sorry, for, I guess educators or administrators when they're trying to figure out what kind of technology to use? Should they just be surveying their students? Should they be surveying their educators? What would your advice be on that front for identifying good solutions?
Yeah, well, a few are. It's very easy when making technology decisions and having technology discussions to forget that technologies are only as powerful as the communities that use them. So the first thing I would say is, one of the most important considerations is not even necessarily which technology approach you're going to choose, but how are you going to provide support to the students and teachers and families using these technologies so they're useful. And if you can't provide that support, then maybe it doesn't make sense to add another thing to the mix. A second consideration is that I think, the people who are really excited about education technology tend to describe technologies and their capacities in sweeping terms. But in fact, most of our education technologies are like pretty targeted. They're good at very particular things. We have some really good kind of gamified, adaptive tutoring software for young kids in math. We don't really have evidence that suggests that those same kinds of things work that well in reading. And we don't really make them at all in history and social studies and science. So like there's an approach that works, and it works in a particular corner of the curriculum for particular people, like a learning management system. It's good at some things. It sort of operates like the folder that your kid has in their backpack, where one side says to school and one side says to home. It sort of moves things back and forth. A video conferencing tool, it allows certain kinds of communications. I saw a great question online, which was for fourth graders learning fractions. Is it important that they draw their own number lines, or can we use some kind of computer generated number lines? Like, what a magnificent question. And if the answer to that question is it's important for them to draw their own number lines, how do you see them draw their number lines? Totally trivial to do in an in-person classroom. I don't even think about it. I just wander around, look at their number lines. But if I want to do it online, I can think of myself like, are they writing? They're writing on whiteboards and holding them to the screen? Am I teaching their kids to make their own document cameras? But the point is, our technologies are specific and they address sort of specific issues. So if I was picking new technologies, I would think like either what's the thing that we're really great at that we really want to build on, and what kinds of technologies will help us do that? Or what kinds of things are we particularly missing? Like what's a learning routine that we all really wish that we could do, or a content area in which we don't feel like we're serving students well that we want to add to? There are dozens of answers to those questions. And one of the things that schools tried to do in March and April, where they said, oh, well, let's just send students home with all these different technologies that could sort of meet all of these different functions. Let's give them this whole suite of little particular tools. And that drove parents and students crazy because all of a sudden they had 36 logins and passwords to keep track of and lose, and all these routines to learn, and teachers that couldn't sort of rapidly provide training. So most school systems, I think, come this past September, really restricted the suite of tools that they asked teachers and families and students to use. Not because there weren't other good choices out there, but because every technology tool comes with this sort of overhead and logistical cost. And we can't use all the things that we want to use. So, I think that's part of what explains the kind of the disappointment, the frustration for most folks in online learning, is that basically we're cobbling together these systems with a set of tools that like do some functions well, but not others, work for some students, but not others, and some subject areas, but not others. And it's nowhere near as sort of flexible as a human being in an in-person classroom. Now, places like Western Governors University, my interpretation of them is they would say, we're going to take a suite of tools and we're going to make it work to the best of our abilities. And then we're going to let people opt into this system. And so folks who feel like they would be well served by the system that we've built will come in and do that. And the folks that are kind of on the fence, we're going to build this huge infrastructure of human support to help them. And then there are going to be some people who don't learn particularly well, who don't enjoy it, who need an in-person circumstance, who need synchronous learning, and they'll find other opportunities elsewhere. And I think one of the things that Western governors discovered, along with Southern New Hampshire and other places, is there was this, very large population of folks that was not being well served by the existing system. But I don't think that very large population will ever become 100% of learners. We often think when we see really cool, explosively growing new things like Western governors, like, oh, that's the thing that's going to help and change and transform higher education, or MOOCs or something like that. And we often find like, no, they actually can do a really great job of serving a sort of modestly large niche. But boy, there are a lot of other learners that are out there. That would be my my take on things.
I think that's some good advice. Omid, do we want to switch to some audience questions now for the remainder of the time?
Yeah, I might just ask one more question more
Yep.
broadly before, and I encourage anyone who has questions, again, please feel free to populate the Q&A. We see some great questions coming in already. We're going to jump to those in just a couple of minutes. I do have one last question for Justin, and this is a broad question. I think we have a lot of administrators in the audience who are responsible, put in the position of being, having to direct the decisions that impact their student constituents. We also have students in the audience. And I think as we're thinking about all of the very many challenges that we're grappling with, there is a common phenomenon that we all know as FOMO, the fear of missing out, or the fear that you're not doing the exact right thing. When I do my own work with individual students, I remind them that there's an alternative to FOMO. It's called JOMO, which is the joy of missing out. And the sheer presenting of that alternative somehow seems to have this magical power, that recognizing that you don't have to do all the right things that everybody else is doing helps to target the feeling of feeling overwhelmed that maybe cripples innovation or cripples your ability to focus on what you need to do. And so I wonder if in general you have any recommendations or strategies for administrators, educators, and teachers as we're navigating this current pandemic, but also as we think about how we're going to move past this pandemic and eventually go back to a new normal or to the previous normal, that you found to be particularly useful in your work.
Well, for moving forward, and I've seen some of this in the chat, the sort of two crucial questions are, what do we want to hold on to? What new practices have emerged that we're really excited about, we want to keep? And then what do we want to hospice? What do we want to let go of? What kinds of things did we stop doing during the pandemic that we could look back and be like, oh, we didn't need that at all. What a waste. And now we have this more time to do other kinds of things. For the particular moment, I think administrators have a really complex challenge, which is that they don't know how to build a system that works under that circumstance. So ideally what you'd like to do is make a bunch of experimental, iterative kinds of changes to tinker your way to a new practice. That on the face of it sounds reasonable. Like, of course we don't know what to do, so we better try a bunch of things. Now, what sounds to an administrator like thoughtfully making a series of incremental experiments, to teachers sounds like trying to do their job on quicksand. We interviewed a bunch of teachers in April and May of last year, and they basically were saying, our administrators, the university, our district, they were just constantly changing the rules and the expectations, and we can never get sort of fully grounded. But you also can't just pick a way of doing things at the outset, because you're going to be wrong about all kinds of things. So you somehow have to balance this need to provide enough consistency to the community so that they feel like there's some stability to do their work, while also providing, sort of opportunities for innovation. I think there's two ways to manage that. One is to pick the things that you're going to hold steady, and to pick the things that you're going to experiment and iterate on. I think a lot of schools decided we're going to take a small technology suite and hold that steady. At the beginning of the year, in K-12 schools, it was, we're going to teach you how to use a learning management system, a video conferencing tool, something for math, something for reading, and then maybe one or two other things. And everybody's got to make that work. Then we can do all kinds of experiments with, schedule or classes or pedagogies or expectations or other routines, but that's going to be consistent. I'm not saying technology has to be that thing, but I think every community needs to pick, these things are going to be our tent poles, and we'll make other changes around that. And then the second thing is to think about the timing of experimentation. I think, a bunch of the suggestion that we were made, which some institutions took up, was to say, try to break your year up into these definable points that are a little bit smaller than you usually do. A quadmester, a marking period, and say something like, okay, it's a new day here in January. We've got a new semester starting. We're going to try some different things. And we're going to make a plan, and we're pretty much going to run that plan through February or through, for 4 weeks or 6 weeks. And we're going to try not to change things too much. But we are going to let you know that at this midpoint is when we make changes. So you can anticipate that things will be pretty steady from here until there. And if there's stuff that's really not working, you can anticipate that we'll have like a new thing to try or a new thing to fix 4 weeks from now or 6 weeks from now. I think that kind of approach helps people manage experimentation and change more than, every single week, like at any given point, we might ask you to change what you're doing, because that drives people crazy.
Great. Right, I think we're gonna transfer over to some audience questions, if you don't mind. We have some rolling in here. So I think this one will kind of be a nice segue from the response that you just gave us. So we've already talked about a few important points, such as, social support and self-regulation that are important for navigating these online learning environments. So we have the question, what else do you think is fundamental to in-person education that would be difficult or impossible to replicate in online learning?
One answer to that question is nothing. And I think Western Governor and other kinds of nearly fully online institutions generate that. For student, the trick ends up being for students who opt in to online learning. We can create, I'm sure there are things, nobody wants a surgeon to do their first surgery having only been trained in online courses and simulators and things like that. But most things are not like surgery. Most topics can be learned online. The challenge is that I think it's increasingly clear that many people don't have good skills or habits or conditions around self-regulated independent learning. That there's all kinds of things that are built into schools that help us stay motivated and stay focused. I think a lot about imagine a third grader who gets bored with what they're doing in a classroom and lifts their head up and looks around. And they see like a sea of other little heads doing whatever it is they're supposed to be doing. And their kindly teacher sort of gives them a look like, oh, you've lifted your head up. That's a strange thing to do right now. And so that kid looks around and is like, I guess I'll put my head down and keep doing what I was doing. There's no intervention on that person except the sort of social pressure of seeing everyone around them doing what they're supposed to be doing. And I think there's similar things like that in in-person higher education and so forth. Now imagine that same kid trying to do Zoom school and lifts her head up from her Chromebook or from our iPad. Now when she looks around, there's like a refrigerator full of snacks in the corner and a Nintendo Switch on that side and my dog on this side. And it's like, yeah, I think I'll just go choose one of these other things. So I think I think there's some things that we know that we could have said like, oh, it's really helpful to have a teacher in person to answer your questions or other things like that. I think there's all kinds of things that we are realizing, for our most poverty impacted students, realizing things like schools provide a chair that's comfortable to sit in to work on. And there are however many thousands or hundreds of thousands of kids who are having to do work from their bedroom or from some other kind of physically uncomfortable space. In schools, we can control to some extent the amount of noise that exists in that space. A lot harder to do in cramped apartment buildings and those kinds of things like that. I also think there's like a set of instructional practices that we can do, that teachers can do almost effortlessly in person, which are probably possible to do online, but no one has figured out how to do them in efficient ways yet. I think the example I gave you before of glancing at a bunch of kids drawing number lines, in a math education teacher methods course, you wouldn't spend time teaching a teacher how to wander around the class looking at number lines. It's sort of intuitive. Like you just get up, you wander around the desk, you look over their shoulders, some idiot kid has put books around their desk. And so you knock their books down so you can actually see what they're doing. And nobody needs to instruct you about that, and it turns out that real-time monitoring of student thinking and performance is enormously important. That particular task is just really hard to think about. How would you watch 24 kids in a Zoom room draw number lines. I'm sure it's possible. There are brilliant teachers out there figuring it out, but it's just like an enormous amount of work. And then you have to say, okay, so that's like one little practice. Multiply that one little practice by however many units there are in 4th grade math, multiplied by the number of subjects we teach in the school, multiplied by 13 grades. And like, that's the, like that enormous number is all the things that we need to figure out. Yogan asked this question, like, how can we embed online teaching with effective active learning? There are some things that are sort of already built into online learning environments that are kind of better than in-person teaching and learning. There's I don't know, in our classes, one of the things that we've been doing a ton, just using the chat window here, is we'll ask questions. We'll say, everybody write down your answer to a question. And we're all going to hit return at the same time. And we call them waterfall questions because you see this kind of waterfall of responses. And it doesn't work great with 200 people, but with like 20 or 30 or 40 people, it looks terrific. There's not really a good equivalent of that in the in-person classroom where you can have everyone think about a thought, everyone write down a thought, and then everyone put their thought in a shared space rapidly where we can all kind of look at it. So there are things that we can do in person with technology that are better. The challenge is, I think, is that for most of the things that we teach, for a typical classroom teacher, higher education instructor, they just like intuitively, flexibly know how to handle a much, much wider array of circumstances and pedagogical approaches in in-person circumstances. And solving problems that are totally trivial in person can be these total brain busters when you try to figure out, like, how do I use a limited suite of technology we have to do that little thing that's super important for like 3 class periods online.
I wonder if I can push on that a little bit. And one of the themes that's come up not only in the chat and the questions, but also over and over during the pandemic is the theme of equity, and how basically the remote platforms and remote experiences have aggravated inequity. I've also heard you speak about the digital divide, and as we think about not just access to technology, but also usage, the differential usage of technology, and that how that plays out. And as you were just highlighting, there are some really creative ways in which we can focus on the things that matter, based on this recognition that there are these inequitable patterns of usage or access. I wonder if you can maybe share a few more ideas, a few more recommendations that might be attuned to the concerns around inequitable access or inequitable experiences that we're now facing given the pandemic.
Yeah, well, I mean, one challenge is talking to a group of educators. These are not problems entirely that educators can solve. I mean, I think one of the things that we've seen during the pandemic, which has been super frustrating to me, has been to say, oh, the kids have mental health issues. Why aren't the schools providing more mental health supports, remote mental health supports? Oh, the kids don't have internet. Why aren't the schools providing more internet? The kids don't have enough food. Why aren't the schools providing more meals? Your local superintendent can't roll fiber optic cable like out up the holler or, into urban apartment buildings or things like that. Other parts of society, one thing that we've discovered during the pandemic is the extraordinary degree to which our social safety net depends upon schools. And it's crazy. We should have, a multiplicity of institutions that are providing support to students and families with students. But as I think educators should have that. I would encourage them to have that kind of approach as citizens. It's actually not that helpful as educators. You guys should have this approach like, well, I just got to figure out how to solve all of these things. One of the things that I've observed in educators as I've done research on their attitudes towards equity is there are teachers who are really concerned about inequalities within their classroom. Omid has access to this and Nicole doesn't, so I'm not going to do this thing anymore. And then there are some teachers who are really concerned about inequalities beyond classrooms or between different settings. It's pretty hard for Omid and Nicole to do this thing, but kids in the affluent suburbs are able to do it. So I've just got to figure out a way to make it work. And my experience is if you find educators that are doing the best, most innovative, most ambitious work to create powerful digitally mediated experiences for students in poverty impacted, marginalized kinds of communities, they tend to have that latter attitude. They tend to focus, both of them are equity oriented attitudes. They both care about differences between people. But you know, the teachers who tend to say like, I know this is going to be easier for Nicole than Omid, but I'm going to do it because it's way easier for the kids in the suburbs or the students at the four-year private colleges. And so we just have to try to make this opportunity available, even if it means being creative about how we provide more supports for Omid. So I think one attitude we can cultivate in ourselves is to say, even when things are hard, let's see about how we can do them and how we can provide the additional supports. And then I think it's to be really attentive to the fact that there are these differences not only in who has access to technology, but how it gets used. We've known for 30 years that when students use computers in math class, non-white, Black, brown students, Native American students, and students from poverty impacted backgrounds are more likely to use those technologies for drill and practice kinds of things. And affluent white students are more likely to use technologies for graphing, for creativity, for exploration, for simulation, those kinds of things. Why aren't we providing the same kinds of opportunities for both of those groups of students? I've gotten quite concerned about, you see schools with all kinds of rules and regulations about how to participate in Zoom classes, that, you have to wear shoes, you can't eat food, you have to wear certain kinds of clothing, you have to keep your camera on. I'm very confident that all of those kinds of regulations are policed against Black students in ways that they're policed against white students, because we have decades of research that shows that Black and brown students are more likely to be punished for subjective infractions of rules and punished more harshly for infractions of rules than white students. So even you think about something like, well, every student in the country who's doing remote learning is doing it through Zoom. It's all going to be the same for everyone. This is an equalizing force. It's like, no, because we live in unjust, in racist and bigoted society, and that racism, despite sometimes our best intentions is in all of us, it gets enacted in these different kinds of ways. So for educators, some of it is really just being very intentional. I was talking with a group of educators in urban schools who are doing hybrid learning, and they were saying, with these new mask rules, we've got to really make sure that when there are infractions around not wearing your mask or taking off your mask or goofing around your mask, that we don't punish some kids more than others. And I think those things are good to be attentive to. There's a whole other section of the book too, which takes on these questions from the point of view of education technology companies. If we know that new technologies disproportionately benefit the affluent, like what do you do as a funder, as a builder, as a technology developer to try to sort of fight against that and wrestle against that? And there's a bunch of suggestions in the books, but one of the core ones is that unfortunately the people in society who have the opportunity to build new tools are often of very different demographic backgrounds than the young people who end up using them. There's a lot of affluent white males in Cambridge and in Silicon Valley and in Austin who get to build EdTech. And that's not what the people who are using EdTech look like, especially as we transition into a public school system in the United States, where white students will become the minority. So we've got, one way, what we need to rejigger our society and make all these pathways to opportunity more equitable in the longer term. But in the shorter term, we just have to make sure that when teams are formed to build new technologies, that those teams include folks who have experience, working in the most marginalized parts of our education system, and sort of understand the perspectives of the people who are working there and learning there, and that those ideas are from the beginning baked into plans to develop and deploy new technologies.
Yeah, this theme of equity was really big in your book, and I think maybe we have time to just squeeze in one last audience question related to that theme. So one thing we know about in-person learning is these active learning strategies are an effective way to close equity gap in attainment within that course. So one of the questions from the audience, which I'm also really interested in, is how can we embed online teaching with these effective active learning strategies, especially when you move into an asynchronous environment? How do we actually use those strategies that we know close equity gaps in the classroom, and how do we transfer those to an online environment?
Yeah, right. Because a bunch of those active learning strategies part of what makes them engaging is the kind of immediate feedback that you get from them. Students are called upon to express their thinking in some kind of way, and then the architecture of the classroom reacts to that in some way. So you answer a clicker question and you see a poll show up on the board, or you think a thought and then you turn and you express it to your neighbor, or you articulate it to your teacher in some kind of way. One of the ways that technologists have tried to address that is to create technologies that provide automated feedback to student work. The problem is that there's a relatively small handful of domains in which we're good at building those technologies. They work well in early language acquisition. They work well in certain parts of mathematics. They work well in certain parts of computer science, learning a computer program and things like that. They don't work really well in evaluating natural human language written or orally. I can't say, explain to me how plate tectonics work and have you, give a sort of 30-second narration. Our computers can't say very much. It can't give you meaningful feedback around that. But reasoning from evidence in natural language is like the main thing that we ask students to do in school. If you look at every assignment that we give kids in 16 years of education, most of them would look like this thing that computers are not that good at doing. So, instructional designers have to figure out ways of building systems that feel like for students, they're getting meaningful feedback. And there's a wide range of ways that we can do that. Some of them, require more programming like hinting systems or AI feedback systems or other kinds of things like that. Some of them are just building learning environments in which we ask students to think and reflect, and then they are immediately encounter other kinds of learning materials that give them something to push their ideas against. But I think, I think this is one of the real Achilles heels of asynchronous learning experiences, is that it, for a lot of learners, it just can feel like they're not really getting meaningful reactions to their thinking. This is also why, there's plenty of in-person lecture classes which students don't like for the exact same reasons. You can also have a pretty sterile experience just sitting in a lecture hall or a classroom, listening to someone talk at you. I think the thing to recognize is that there are not easy solutions to the answer to that question. I'm pretty sure there's not new AI research just around the corner that's going to transform all of our thinking around this issue, because super smart people with millions and millions of dollars have been working on this for decades, and we make little incremental itty bits of improvement. And we're not on the cusp of AlphaGo or chess things or other kinds of things like that. They're going to sort of blow us away. So it's going to be this combination of, and it'll be different in every subject area. What it looks like in nursing is going to be different than what it looks like in home economics. It'll be different than what it looks like in calculus or Mandarin. But one thing that's going to be kind of exciting to look at in the years ahead is that we now have a whole generation of teachers and learners who have had this immense crash course in technology mediated learning. And there's all kinds of discussions going on about learning loss, about all the things that kids were supposed to study that didn't. But young people are learning all the time. There's a tremendous assets to be drawn on from this moment. Young people have learned more about self-paced independent learning than any generation has in history. I think there's probably more young people that are ready to be successful in Western Governor University courses as a result of this pandemic than had ever been before. There's more teachers who have experimented with technology mediated teachings in new kinds of ways.
Yes, and I want to pause there. I could speak to you. I listened to you speak all day, and just engaging by the.
We gotta let people go.
I think this is definitely worth continuing. I encourage anyone who hasn't already picked up a copy of his book, to do so. Is by far the best book I've read all year. Please check us out on Twitter and LinkedIn at WGU Labs, and we'd be happy to continue the conversation if you have questions. We hope to continue our engagement with Justin, because this has been thought-provoking and truly inspirational. It's and thanks to your work that the whole field is moving incrementally towards better insight and better progress. I want to thank you for your time. Thank you all for being here as part of this conversation, and we'll be sharing some of the resources and recordings after today's conversation. Again, Justin, thank you, and thank you for all of you for being here.
You bet. Nice to meet you all. Thanks, Nicole. Thanks, Emmy.
Take care.
Bye.